Good morning, bon matin, everyone. Welcome to all our members and guests on behalf of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce and our partner for this webinar and a patron of the Chamber, Mazars. So today's topic is time for action, driving the C-Suite agenda. The Mazars C-Suite barometer, a survey of over 1,000 executives around the world, is an annual publication that analyses the key issues faced by C-Suite executives in companies around the world. The last publication in early 2022 identified a sense of confidence and resilience, which has been challenged by the ongoing impact of the pandemic, rising inflation, and the horrifying attack on Ukraine. During this webinar, Mark Kennedy, partner and group executive board member of Mazars, and Florence Pinot, partner Mazars in France, will assess key topics on the C-Suite agenda, including an assessment on the response from French C-Suite executives and what the findings mean for the organizations doing business with France. So I'd just like to introduce you to our speakers. So Mark Kennedy. Mark has been a partner at Mazars since 2004 and has extensive experience providing audit assurance and related services to large and listed companies with expertise in the banking and insurance sectors. Elected a member of the Mazars Group Executive Board in 2020, Mark works with partner teams to develop their international business and offering to clients. He is currently also a member of the Executive Board of Mazars in the UK, leading the development of the large and listed market segment. And Mark was the managing partner of Mazars in Ireland from 2015 to 2021. And we're very honoured to have also our speaker from France, and Florence. Vous êtes très bienvenue ici. And Florence, in June 2013, she became the managing partner of Mazars in Russia, leading a firm of 200 professionals in 3 offices and 4 business units: audit, outsourcing, financial advisory, and tax and legal. So Florence has more than 15 years of experience in different spheres of financial services within Mazars. Florence is also co-chair of the CCIFR Committee of the Tax and Accounting. She is an active participant of different business events, and her native language is French, but she also speaks English fluently and Russian. So thank you to both our speakers for joining us today, and just like to remind you also to our participants that we will be using the chat for any questions for a Q&A we'll allow time for at the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to pass you over to Mark, who's going to lead on this discussion. So Mark, over to you, and thank you.
Thanks, Lena, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. We're delighted to have the opportunity to present a little bit on the C-Suite barometer to the members of the France-Ireland Chamber. And I'm particularly pleased to have Florence join me, as well as being the managing partner of Russia, which over the years, which has given her, I suspect, an insight into some current affairs that the rest of us don't have. She's one of the leadership team of our outsourcing business internationally, so has a broad perspective on a lot of business issues and on the challenges that businesses are facing at present. The C-Suite barometer, and Lena has introduced it well there, is an annual survey. And really what we're trying to do over the years is get an opportunity to interface with business leaders internationally and see what's on their agenda for the coming year. So we've been working over the last 3 years on this initiative and publishing each year some data. From a background point of view, it tends to focus more on the CEO category. We get more respondents from the CEO category, which is interesting because it gives us, as a firm of auditors and accountants and other professionals who are quite technical by nature, a very broad business view on what's on the agenda of larger companies around the world. We've also tried to focus it, obviously, the large and listed space and PIE space is very important, and that's a particularly important market for Mazars internationally. But again, over the years, we've tried to focus it more, for at least a segment of the respondents, on the large privately owned business. And some of these can be very large, as we know. If you think in Ireland, the top 500 companies or so, many of them are actually privately owned, even if they are international, operating in many countries and face similar challenges to their listed peers. But it does bring I think, an insight which is a little bit different and quite useful. And the last thing we try and do is we get a good global spread. So as Dana said, we have over 1,000 respondents each year, most of whom are not Mazars clients. We deliberately try not to select Mazars clients into the sample, but we do get a regional element and get a good view of all of the different regions around the world, even if we tend to find more respondents coming from the more mature markets. But we do get quite a spread, and that again is interesting when we dive into the detail. So I suppose last year the survey was run coming up to Christmas time last year. It was quite unique, I suppose, in that most businesses were at that stage feeling they were coming out of COVID and had survived and weathered the challenges of the last 2 years. But and excuse me, I think that informs that sense of confidence which is pervasive, and in a way maybe explains the headline for today, which is time for action, which was really coming true in the responses we got, where CEOs were saying, okay, we've had this period of unforced stasis, and now we've got an appetite to go and grow and develop and so on. And clearly things didn't pan out quite like that this year. As Cliona has alluded to, has been quite a unique year so far, and many challenges that I think nobody would have thought about in December last year. So we're going to try and reflect on that in today's presentation, and not just talk about the survey, but also to bring in a perspective on some of the issues that have emerged since then. You know, it is forecasting is always difficult, and we don't want to get into it, but it's natural in these kind of surveys that one looks ahead and tries to make some best estimate of what's going to happen next. So we'll give you a little flavor of that. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to just give you a highline on the top issues that emerged globally. I'm going to hand over to Florence then, who's going to give you a little bit of an insight. We thought it was interesting to maybe have a view on what issues the French respondents were focusing on. And there's 2 or 3 key differences there, I think, that Florence is going to focus on, rather than trying to capture the whole view, but maybe some of the more essential elements. And Florence is then going to pick up on that issue of what happened in 2022 so far, and has assembled, I think, some interesting insights into, again, with a French perspective, where the world is going from here. And then we'll wrap up and hopefully have some questions to deal with. So encourage you to put some comments and questions in the chat as we go along. So 6 messages really from the survey. First, that point of confidence, and really I think that's coming from a sense of, we have survived COVID. A lot of companies have developed resilience, and there was a feeling back in the autumn last year that trade was beginning to pick up. And truth be told, there's a very sectoral story. You can see in some sectors, actually, the last 2 years have not been a bad period, despite some of the concerns at the start of the pandemic that maybe companies felt. I think there's another point that I think comes out in the feedback when you look into the detail, which is there has been a fundamental change in the way the world works. We've seen massive public intervention in markets. Obviously, we go back to the global financial crisis, and that's a theme that's there. But in the last 2 years, governments that would not have supported businesses a decade ago have been very active in supporting businesses in different ways. And I think that has changed the position quite significantly. And I mention it not because it feeds into so much that air of confidence, though perhaps in a way it does, but more that as we look forward, whether that sustains or not, and particularly against the changing central bank position, business may have to look at a slightly different landscape. So that first message is really about confidence. The second message is about transformation. And if there was a single word in the word cloud that came out from the respondents, transformation stood out. And again, that was picking up on this feeling that we've had a period where technology had changed and been seen to change effectively very quickly. And so top of the list in most of the respondents' view was technological transformation. Sustainability, and there was a concern that companies would move away from a kind of a sustainability agenda, actually appears to be reinforced, but perhaps a broadening of what that means, much more focus on the social, and for companies in a real world sense, maybe things like mental health, well-being, employee care came very much to the fore and became very practical elements of that sustainability agenda. And performance improvement comes through quite strongly. And again, maybe that's a reflection on a feeling that emerging from pandemic, we had a resource constraint, and we've certainly seen that in the current year. So these reflect, I think, CEOs thinking ahead at the end of 21 and reacting to what they saw as the signs in those areas and doubling down on that in terms of how they saw their investment budgets for the coming year and coming years. Third message really is about the technological revolution. Maybe just to kind of dive into that a little bit. I think the comms and collaboration piece is well established, and we're sitting here today having a session on Teams. I think 3 years ago, Cleona and I would have been, and Florence would have been in a room somewhere in Dublin addressing you face to face. And there has been quite a change there, and that brings with it flexible working issues and a lot of issues around privacy and management of data and broadening out into a wider agenda, which I think companies have grappled with. And in many ways, when we're on a journey, we're well advanced on that journey. I think there's a couple of other things, though, that follow from it. And it's interesting to see some of the commentary again in the detail of the responses, where you see where companies are beginning to focus globally. Digital experience becoming a very important part. Many companies, give an example of a client of ours, Decathlon, which would have been at the start of the pandemic at the far end, I suppose, of the digital sales revolution. We're very much a real world company and very profitable and very successful. Within a year had converted to a position where they're now the leading company in their category in digital experience. And that kind of change happened in a lot of businesses. So making that real has been a real agenda. And for many companies who didn't get the chance to invest in the same way, they're now looking at that agenda. And we see further developments, things like the metaverse obviously have become very common. And again, that is a retail focused agenda at the moment. Second thing is AI. There's been a significant shift, I think, in the last number of years in terms of the data management under the bonnet that companies have achieved. So artificial intelligence is becoming more and more of an investment topic for larger companies. And I think a lot of business leaders are reflecting on those and then looking at maybe a couple of issues that arise from that. First of all, have they got technology expertise in the boardroom? Have the leadership got the capability to actually manage and think ahead on the changes that need to be made for businesses? The second is around the war for talent. And I think most sectors are stressed at the moment, but anybody who has large IT teams will tell you that's a really hot market at the moment. So that technological experience, and particularly those who can manage to join technology expertise with business expertise, are very rare and highly valued. So companies are switching to see how they manage to develop skills in attracting those kind of talents if they hadn't them before. And the last thing is the risks and opportunity landscape is changing, partly commercial because of some of the factors that I'm mentioning, but also on the cyber side. I think there's a much more heightened awareness of cyber risk. I think in the survey you see in some of actually in the proportion of respondents who feel that their data is safe, a little bit of naivety. And I think I'd point to two things that we see in the real world when we're working with clients in this space. The first is that the focus has been on protection of the domain. So keeping people out of our technology suites and keeping them out of our systems has been very much the focus. And what we found when we do work with clients is we see that there's far less attention to what goes on within the system. And actually, if there's a breach in your outer wall, many companies are not equipped to identify when somebody is in their system and trying to do things that are bad or to create problems. And that is becoming a focus area for a lot of CEOs. How do we invest in that and reinforce that? The second thing is around the area of insurance, and it's probably an open secret at this stage that most of the major underwriters are going to move away from writing cyber risk in the way they do today. Whether that means a complete exodus from the market in 2 or 3 years' time, as has been suggested in the US, or it's something more of a change in policies. Again, the risk management radar for companies has to change on that agenda. So that's I think an important point to consider. The next message is really around ESG being here. As I said earlier, there was a fear, I think, for a while that we'd see less focus on ESG issues. But in fact, you can see in the data that actually over the 2 years since we started doing the survey, the focus has moved from mid-40s to mid-60s in terms of the intent to invest. So most companies are now saying we're going to have a strategy in the next 3 years if we haven't got it already. 75% of them are saying that they want to increase investment in initiatives, whether those are internal or market facing. And actually, the development of more market-facing opportunities is quite interesting. And there's a lot of confidence that they can manage, again, touching on that confidence theme. But there are a couple of things that I think we need to reflect on. First of all, less than 50% of companies are saying to us that they're targeting net zero. So they're dealing with what they feel they can manage. You see things like waste, those employee issues, those things that companies can really tangibly address are top of the agenda for most CEOs. And the reasoning for investment is quite interesting. And I think Florence may pick up on this. It's seen very much as a branding issue. So that issue of greenwashing and being careful of it is quite important. And for global companies, the other key driver is client expectations. So again, it's very much a market-facing trend at the moment rather than something that's maybe buried in the purpose of companies. So more growth to go there. Last word on it, maybe on the reporting side, and obviously as an accountancy firm, it's something that we're very focused on. The regulation is beginning to bite there, and we've seen even in the last week the CSRD confirmed at a European level. So the plans we've been talking about in terms of more reporting for more companies are going to start to roll out, and really that means next year, because by the time you do your accounts, you need to have comparatives and so on, and there's a lot of change to happen there, and that will drive a number of challenges for companies. And the last thing, I said that I think it was 6 messages, so there's really 2 hidden here, and it's really about making it happen and people side of things. Survey tells us 2 kind of interesting things. First of all, there's an anticipation of that resource shortage. I think CEOs could see that already last year, could see it as they emerged. You could see that staff who were leaving who hadn't left maybe during the pandemic, had stayed with businesses, were starting to broaden their horizons and look at very different agendas. And what we're seeing in the survey then is a real focus on purpose and values as a key attractor, and more companies trying to work on that cultural agenda as a way of making themselves distinct in the marketplace. The second issue that comes out, and I think Florence again will touch on this, is around the D&I element of things and a much broader sense, as I said, of what that means. And there's huge cultural differences in that, which means for an international company that spreads around the world, as we do as a partnership, we're in all regions of the world, in 93, almost 94 countries, I think today. There is very different paces, very different demands, and very different local agendas that it's quite difficult as a global organization to manage. So that area of employees, I think, continuing to be a real issue through 22 and beyond. And the last thing is leadership skills. And while there's some interesting feedback on where the focus is around vision or around problem solving, I think the other message that we got when we looked at the detail by region was there are serious shortages of leadership in certain regions of the world, including, I would say, in Europe. And the ability to create a pipeline for the future is something that many leaders are now turning to. So that's a very quick run around the global messages, and I hope I didn't go too quickly, but we can come back to topics as we go along. And I'm going to hand over to Florence for a few minutes just to maybe deep dive on France and, as I say, pick up on some of the 2022 issues.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. I hope you are seeing my screen. Yeah. So, as Mark mentioned, the C-Suite barometer includes many different questions about the strategic vision of leaders. Mark and I went through the French responses more specifically and selected a few themes, areas where we wanted to comment a little bit today. So about methodology and sample, I think Mark explained a little bit how we did this survey. So now what about what do French leaders think? So we selected today a few areas. It is about confidence, about business transformation, in which areas French leaders expect most transformation, COVID again and again, and ESG, which is, of course, the unavoidable topic of the decade, I think. What about confidence? How do our executives feel? How do they see the future? So one of the most noticeable findings of the barometer in a whole is a good optimism of executives. Interestingly, it is even more true for French leaders. 92% of them predict revenue growth this year, which is higher than the 86% of the global respondents. In parallel, they mentioned they are confident in their ability to recover from crisis. 86% of the leaders are confident in their ability to overcome a crisis. About business transformation, so there were several answers proposed to the respondents. According to the answers collected, the transformation foreseen by French executives are driven by their vision of their business in their sector, with a seek for performance improvement being the highest rate of response on that question. But also the pressure of external factors, I would say, bring also new need of transformation related to technology, of course, and to the sustainability strategy. So those technology and sustainability, here leaders feel the pressure of their environment. There are also new and mainly the regulations changes forces them to bring transformations in their companies. I would take an example in France about the next the project of bringing e-invoicing obligatory in France. The French government announced that they would enforce the use of electronic invoices for all taxable transactions in France between 2024 and 2026. In 2024, the obligation of issuing e-invoices will concern at first very large companies. 2025 will oblige mid-sized companies to jump, and 2026 will be the last year where it will become obligatory for all companies. It's just an example about how the business environment will can influence, of course, the need of transformation for the companies. About COVID pandemic crisis has definitely brought some short-term challenges that business had to face immediately to operate. The two biggest challenges reported by French leaders were the need to adapt to remote work and business travel restrictions. But in a longer perspective, COVID crisis brought also changes that are going to remain. And among them, the most frequently reported were the need for a stronger IT security, enhanced digital experience, an increase of remote interactions, and an increased remote or flexi working schemes. However, interestingly, we can see that this remote or flexi working change was reporting globally as the first change brought by COVID, whereas in France it appears only at the fourth position. And I would like to maybe say that to my mind, really people have started to go back to the office in France now. Not in all sectors, and we will comment this a little bit later on. ESG, which is the biggest topic of the moment. French responses on these topics are very much aligned with the global results. Funding and complexity are considered as the most significant barriers to ESG investment, which is particularly true, however, for smaller companies. ESG projects are indeed complex because they touch all functions of the business, operations at first, but also all support functions, HR, IT, communication. And building up an ESG strategy requires a lot of internal and external resources. In parallel, companies face other strategic challenges that require also a lot of investments, such as technology, cybersecurity. And I think there is a conflict of interest between all those urgencies. So there must be a very strong will from the top to avoid the deprioritizations in terms of budget for ESG, I think. What are the main drivers, however, to invest in ESG project? Brand and reputation appears to be the first response in France as well as globally. Employee expectations and long-term growth. Employee expectations appear much higher in France than in the whole group of respondents. And here I would like to comment a little bit about a very recent trend in France amongst young graduates. In June, this summer period is coinciding with the end of the academic year, and two graduations ceremonies made a lot of noise in France. It was AgroParisTech and HEC, where the speeches of students were very much focused on ESG, and they clearly mentioned they don't want to work for companies who are not investing in ESG and who are not prioritizing this topic. I think it is a very big trend, and if companies want to attract talents, they will have no other choice than to take this factor into consideration. We asked our respondents whether they have committed to some project in the frame of their ESG strategy. So the most considered project where they have publicly mentioned they would invest is the waste reduction of carbon footprint, and protection or restoration of biodiversity. The ranking in France and in the global panel is quite similar on this topic. Whereas For environmental issues, more in detail, the waste reduction and management appears to be the first topic where companies are ready to invest energy and budget. In the societal aspect of ESG, there are very different ways to invest in social issues. We can witness here that anyway, executives tend to focus on the issues that are inside their companies. If I can see here, employee well-being, labor conditions, health and safety are all topics that are really inside the company, and they appear to be more highly valuated than broader causes like human rights, contribution to social causes, and local communities. If we remain inside the company HR policy and the diversity and inclusion is also a very unavoidable topic in big companies. And we can see here again that the focus and the main point of attention of executives related to employee mental health and well-being and work-life balance initiatives. Again, topics that are very much related to their teams and their talents. However, it's interesting that mental health appears to be a real challenge. Surprisingly, it comes really higher than the pure, I would say, pure D&I topic like gender diversity or inclusion. I think really leaders are facing talent retention challenges, and they are really focusing on the well-being of their employees. About mental health, there is a high in France, a quite interesting focus on psychosocial risk, I would say, with statistics that 2 million employees were declared in a burnout situation in 2021, and it has a huge cost for the economy. It was valuated between 2 and 3 billion euro, the cost of this psychosocial risks, and I think it's a very high challenge to be taken in consideration by executives. So that was the main topics we wanted to discuss out of the C-Suite barometer. However, all those responses go back already to December or 2021. And the first half of 2022, unfortunately, has been the scene of a multitude of profound and concentrated economic developments in a very short period of time, starting from the war in Ukraine, German rearmament, inflation, climatic episodes. The events of this last semester will definitely lead to reassessment of strategic priorities in several dimensions. So today we wanted to touch a little bit on the topics of inflation, fragmentation of world trade, political pressure, and the new influence of politics over the business, disruptions of work modalities, and pressure on the labor market. So inflation in June 22 in France, the official figure for the 12 months inflation reaches 5.8%. Of course, it impacts at first consumer prices, but the next step is necessarily an increase of salaries. So in France, we have already SNCF striking about increase of salaries, and the forecast is that companies will need to increase salaries by 5%. With a 5% salary increase, the provision is that it should not impact too much the purchase power of people. However, the predictions of the central bank is that this inflation will not impact too much the gross margin level of businesses. About deglobalization, statistical data, as we can see on the screen, it's the trade balance has very much dropped during the COVID crisis. But it has led companies to reassess their logistic and purchasing policy. CEOs confirm that more prudent toward the Chinese producers with the concept of China +1. They don't want to have China being the only country where they purchase their input materials, in order to avoid, of course, strong dependencies of one country. So World Trade Organization does not confirm yet a noticeable trend. However, a switch between offshoring and nearshoring is hardly detectable. But in France, more specifically, there is a real incentive from the government to subsidize some relocation projects. So the program France Relance, launched in September 20 by the government, has already been emulated. The French state has highlighted 5 sectors for which there will be a public support in case of relocation projects. It is the case for health, agri-food, electronics, essential industrial inputs, and 5G. So in 2021, there was more than 600 relocalization projects that received subsidies from the French government. Again, about politics, we can notice a greater influence of politics on business. There was, in the last month, the adoption finally by the European instances of the Fit for 55, which is the forecasted end of thermic motors allowed in Europe. It is the first hit touching the automotive sector, but of course other sectors should be touched in the coming years by similar directives. And another very interesting directive that was voted very recently is the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which strongly increases the current obligations of reporting in terms of ESG. And it concerns so far PIEs, mid-cap and listed small caps, but there will be a progressive implementation calendar starting from the financial year 2024. So it means reporting obligations in 2025. Another very big change of the last semester, but not only the last semester, is a change of work. Home office has become quite usual, but we can mention that it is not touching all social categories in the same proportion. Of course, executives are much more entitled to work remotely than lower social categories. And it creates, I would say, new disparities amongst the socio-professional categories. Employment. The last semester has been very dynamic in terms of creation of new jobs. In 2021, there was almost 1 million new job offers, whereas the COVID crisis had only distracted 200,000 jobs. So there is a higher pressure on the labor market, and it increases, of course, the need to fight for talents. Not all of the sectors are equally impacted by this lack of resources. Low skills jobs are the most impacted. They become very much more difficult to fill. Precariousness and difficult work conditions are the main obstacles to recruitment. There is a new trend that people don't want to work anymore under any condition. And I would say the pandemic crisis increased these trends. Workers have become really more selective to the jobs they are ready to take. And about more skilled jobs, I would say employer branding becomes increasingly important to fill skilled jobs. So here we are purely in ESG principles. Proper governance, work conditions, loyalty are criteria that candidates are very much looking into before accepting a job. And what about confidence? Because the last events of this semester were not so nice. However, we can see, I took here the result of a survey conducted by Opinion Way about, this is an interesting survey conducted equally since several years. So we are not now at the top, of course, in comparison with the last years, but still we can see that after the beginning of the war episode between Russia and Ukraine, which has very much hit the optimism indicator, we are steadily facing an increase of this indicator, almost back to a normal confidence indicator.
Which I think which picks up, I think, on the confidence that we had at the start of the year. I'm conscious, Florence, we're coming towards the end of our time, so perhaps we'll put the slides down, and maybe two sets of comments I'd like to make. I'm not sure that we have questions yet, Lena, but maybe two categories. I think for those of us that work with French parent companies, or work a lot with French companies. I think the detailed French analysis touches on a couple of things. There's a strong sense of confidence, as we've said, in France. And actually, what I found interesting working with French companies in the last number of months is this feeling that the French corporate sector sees itself very much as a global player, which is not necessarily the case in all countries. And actually, as someone who spends a lot of time in the UK, it's a sense that's maybe dissipating a little bit over there. But that does change the perspective on investment and development. The second thing is the regulatory drivers are very strong, and Florence touched on a number of them, whether it's in terms of the micro details of how they handle accounting and issues like that. And I think it's changed there, but also even the employment elements that come out strongly, and the interest, therefore, of employers in certain aspects of ESG rather than others. And there's also a very strong voluntary pressure, if I put it that way, which you see coming out in the student and young employee voice, that is really, really important to French companies. And I think they're much more sensitive to it than we are perhaps here, and certainly again in some of the other jurisdictions that we surveyed. It's also visible, and I do spend a bit of time in Paris. There are far more people in Mazars Paris in the last 6 months wandering the corridors and working in their offices than there are in Mazars Ireland, or in Mazars UK, or even in the States, where I was a couple of weeks ago. So I think those kind of differences are quite interesting if you are working with French companies, because it will shape, I think, the strategy over the next couple of years. The other category of comment was just to pick up on the current year, and there's probably, without being too glib about it, there's 3 or 4 things that strike me. One is the role of the state and political risk is definitely back. And Florence touched on globalization, but we see, in different ways, whether it's the push of regulation on businesses, which hasn't abated. We talked about CSRD, but it's there in financial services, it's there in a number of sectors, and the influence of governments in terms of their decision making. And I think there's an interesting question at the moment in terms of whether governments have the appetite to bear the kind of pressure that the central banks are going to put on economies in reaction to inflation, or do they become more populist? There's going to be a big defining issue for many countries and for many businesses within countries. So that issue of political risk, which we got used to kind of treating as a background risk, I think is quite important. The second thing is that the skills risk is very much to the fore. When we touched on leadership, we touched on staff issues. And I think it's changing the makeup of the companies. I think the best companies now are starting to invest in really pushing their technology capability, whether that's through looking at more automation, looking at more AI and so on, developments in those kind of spaces, which will allow them manage their people resource in a very different way. And I think that's, again, a board issue that maybe some of us need to focus on. But the third area that is very short term on that is really around inflation risk. It strikes me that it's probably 30 years since anybody in a senior position had to worry about inflation in a serious way certainly in this part of the world. And the skills aren't there in finance teams. And we see that as coming up as an issue with clients. So I think that the last comment I just wanted to make on that is about flexibility and resilience, and a good message out of the survey. And I think it's sustained in that confidence chart that Florence showed at the end, is that businesses are confident, leadership are confident. They do recognize the risks, but they also know that they managed to be resilient through a very difficult period. And that's changed utterly from 10 years ago, if you think where many businesses were set up in going into the global financial crisis. So I think that investment in resilience builds confidence, and I think is something, again, that needs to stay on the agenda. There's also an issue about flexibility, and I'll leave you on this. Keynes had this saying that, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And I think that's, 100 years later, that's still good advice, that we need to be flexible as business leaders and make sure that we're able to react to the short term as well as sticking to the long-term path. And I think the survey shows us some of those trends that are here for the long term. So thank you again for your time this morning and your attention. It's happy to take any questions. I'm not sure whether we have any, but if there's anything even offline, Cliona, that people wanted to pick up, more than happy to take it up in another forum.
Well, thank you very much, Mark and Florence. Bravo for this presentation. Extremely informative, and there actually are no specific questions, but a few comments just expressing the fact that Mark, that your initial summary of the 6 key message areas was excellent and very informative and useful, and also that people were very interested in Florence's presentation. And so just to let you all know that we have actually recorded this webinar. It will be available to everybody. We'll send you out a message, and also Florence has also kindly offered that we share the presentation with you all. So we'll be doing that. And there's quite a few just thank yous coming in for sharing all the information and insights today. And just before we finish, I know a lot of you are going off on holidays, and I'd like to take the opportunity to wish our members a very enjoyable summer period. And a big event, we were talking about in-person events, one of our highlight events for the second half of the year will be a business lunch, and we're talking about looking at the political influence on business. We will actually have Catherine Day, who's the former Secretary General of the EU Commission, speaking to our members at a business lunch on the 6th of October. So we'll be sending out a save the date this week, and then more details as soon as we have them. So I see, yes, no further questions, just lots of thank yous. And I wish you all a good summer, and we'll see you for la rentrée. Thank you very much. Merci et bonne journée.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Bye.